Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and I am the host of this YouTube channel, Reformed GGA. And today I'm going to be continuing this series for people who are new to PC3's. For those of you who don't know, I use the term PC3 to refer to pistol caliber guns that have some kind of a third point of contact. A great example of what I'm talking about is this CZ Scorpion Evo 3S1. Legally speaking, this is technically considered a pistol. It has a short barrel, and on the back end it has a brace, not a stock. This is legally speaking a pistol. But it's not usually what comes to mind when most people think pistol. So the way that I describe it is that it's a PC3. It's a pistol caliber gun, but it has a third point of contact on the back. So this is kind of the range of gun that we're talking about here today. And in previous videos I discussed some of the reasons why people might like and be attracted to guns like these. You know, they use your handgun ammunition, and so if you already have a handgun, you can get a PC3 that is chambered in that same caliber, and you can pull from the same stash basically. And if that handgun ammunition is relatively cheap, at least compared to maybe some rifle rounds that are out there, it could be a little bit cheaper to run than getting the full-size rifle component. A lot of times they are mechanically, especially if they're blowback, they're mechanically a little bit simpler than a true rifle, shooting a true rifle round. And so that means that maintenance is going to be a little bit easier and those kinds of things. Another thing, because they're pistol caliber, they don't tend to be as intimidating to shoot or as difficult to shoot. You know, take a .308 battle rifle like the AR-10 and compare it to something like this 9mm CZ Scorpion, and this thing is going to be easier and much less intimidating for most people to shoot. So people who are maybe new to firearms or just new to larger format guns in general can very well be attracted to these things for expense, for ammo compatibility, ease of use and maintenance, etc., etc. There's lots of reasons why people might get into these. Some of those reasons don't really apply very much today, like low ammo costs. Pretty much all ammo is uber expensive right now, so that's not as big of an issue. But lots of reasons why people get into them, and after they get into them, if they didn't have this thought already, it's not uncommon for people to sit there looking at it and go, you know, I'd like to be able to actually use that for more than just plinking. And so defensive applications come into play. And when you're talking about a gun that is this form factor, you know, it is smaller than a full-size rifle, but it's not going to fit your daily out and about carry needs very well because it's still pretty big and bulky. You know, you can't exactly slip this in your pocket. You know, there's not exactly an inside the waistband holster that this thing will fit into all that easily. So it doesn't really work for out and about carry situations. But when you're at home, there's no particular reason why you couldn't use something like this. And if this is, you know, the largest, handiest format gun that you have, why not use it? To a lot of people, especially after they start messing around with something like this, any kind of larger format weapon, they realize really quickly that they are just a lot easier to get hits with than handguns are. Handguns are nice when you're out and about because they're concealable and they don't get in the way very much. But handguns really lack in the accuracy departments for most people. Yes, there are good shooters out there that can make some very amazing hits with handguns, but the average Joe, and especially people who are new to firearms in general, they typically suck with handguns. I suck with handguns. And just think about a standard of accuracy like, say, an 8-inch target at 50 yards. An 8-inch target at 50 yards is not a super unreasonable target size, but for people who are new to guns, hitting that target with a handgun is extremely difficult. Getting them to the point where they can actually hold any kind of a decent group at 10 yards is a lot of times very challenging, especially depending on the handgun that they're using and their overall skill level. Okay, even with a handgun, 10 yards can be a challenging shot, and for low-skill people, anything beyond 15 yards is usually extremely, extremely difficult. And I'm not just saying that based on my own observations. I've gone shooting with a lot of people, a varying skill level, and that's what I observe. But even people who are well-recognized firearms instructors and self-defense instructors like John Korea of the Active Self-Protection YouTube channel, people like this, agree that in stressful situations, your accuracy with handguns tends to suck, and most of the time the average person is not going to be able to get anything even close to an accurate shot past 15 yards. It just doesn't work very well. So if you want to be able to be more accurate, and also if you want to make sure that the stress of the situation doesn't inhibit your overall speed into action and be able to deal with the stressful situation, a larger format gun that has some kind of a third point of contact is usually the much better solution. So yes, it's still pistol caliber, and you're going to have to, decide within yourself if that's really the way that you want to go. Do you want to stay with something that's pistol caliber, or do you want to step up to something that's more powerful, like a true rifle round or a shotgun or something like that? But in terms of being able to get accurate hits quickly under stress, some kind of larger format gun, whether it be a shotgun, true rifle, or something like this, anything in those categories is going to be better than a handgun. So a lot of people, like I said, if they get into PC3's and the only other thing that they have around is, their handguns, these things start becoming very appealing in the home defense role. Like I said, they're not very practical when you're out and about, just because, like I said, there's not exactly an inside the waistband holster that will hold one of these things. But at home, there's no reason why you can't use something that's a little larger. And if it means that you're going to be more effective under stress, you're going to get more accurate shots more quickly, and you're going to be able to deal with that stress better, then why not? It makes sense in that role. Now, there are people out there who do deal with tactics and those kinds of things, like John Correa of the Active Self-Protection Channel, John Lavelle of the Warrior Poet Society, people like that are out there that are trained in these things. They're firearms instructors. They deal with these kinds of situations. That's their thing. I'm going to go ahead and let that be their thing. I'm not going to be talking about tactics. What I wanted to talk today about was just simply kit. Stuff, and particularly stuff that you attach to these guns that can either be a significant help or can get in the way. In my experience, based on my own shooting and also observing the people that I go shooting with at various skill levels, I see a great potential danger when it comes to these kinds of things. You get a larger format gun with more rail space, more attachment points and whatnot, and there is definitely a tendency among some people to attach everything that they possibly can to the weapon. And that usually winds up creating problems, unfortunately. Complicated weapons, especially for people who are new or people who are dealing with a stressful situation, is generally not a good thing. I mean, even when I'm out shooting with my friends and, various people that I wind up shooting with, there's not a whole lot of stressors in that kind of situation if you're going out shooting recreationally among people that you know are your friends and whatnot, and nobody's shooting at you. There's not even a formal competition environment a lot of times. We're just going out in the desert setting up targets and plinking. It's not very high stress. But there is still a little bit of stress there in that people are watching you and whatnot. And just that little bit of stress of having somebody watch you is oftentimes enough to make people fumble and do things that they wouldn't normally do. Just that little bit of stress of being watched. Can you imagine how much worse it would be if your life was actually on the line and you were actually being threatened in a real serious way? How much more anxiety and problems there would be? There's lots of people out there who say, yeah, I fumble this and I fumble that from time to time, but if my life was really on the line, I'm sure I'd be able to get it. That's like saying, I have a real hard time jogging for a mile, speaking from experience, but I know that if the day comes to run the marathon, I'm going to be just fine. Now, if you have problems with issues with very low levels of stress, they're not going to get better when the stakes are higher. Okay, that's just not the way that it works. And so keeping your overall system of what you're doing simple for the vast majority of people is exactly where you need to be. Now, yes, there are different attachments and gizmos and gadgets out there that for the right person under the right circumstances with the right amount of training really can make a fantastic difference, but it's usually, like I said, a matter of training. And the vast majority of people that I'm making this video for don't have that level of training. You are not the expert in all things. You need something that's just simply going to be effective for you. Okay? A lot of people out there do not have the time or the budget to invest in a lot of training so that they can make use of every whiz-bang gadget that is out there. So keeping your weapon simple usually winds up having the best long-term benefits for you. And so with regard to most of the things that you can wind up attaching to one of these things, I'm going to say ignore most of it. When it comes down to it, I actually only recommend 3 things. Now, as I've said, I'm not a firearms instructor. I've never been in a self-defense situation, so just take this with a grain of salt and think about it. But there are only 3 things that I really recommend that people attach to their, we'll say, larger format weapon. And that is a sighting system, a light of some kind. Now you'll notice on this gun that there actually isn't a light attached to the gun. When I say that you need to have a lighting system for your gun, I don't necessarily mean attached to it. I need to specify that. But you need some way to aim the gun, you need some way to illuminate the targets, some kind of a lighting system, and last but not least, it is probably, if not certainly, a good idea to have a sling on the gun. You will notice that I do have a sling on this one. Alright, so let's break it down real quick as to what is meant by each of those. We'll talk about sights and lighting together because they go together. The idea behind having some kind of illumination for the gun is that you want to be able to get the gun on target. You want to be able to know that you're actually going to hit what you're aiming at, and you also want, to be able to use the gun effectively. Just spraying bullets in random directions obviously doesn't work. You need to see what you're aiming at, and you need to actually have some kind of an aiming device. The two go together. Go figure. And when it comes to lighting, there are basically 3 lighting levels that you need to think about. The first lighting level is the basic lighting level that you need to identify that a target is present. Not necessarily identify what the target is, but identify that the target is present and be able to use your sights on that target. And that level of lighting is actually really, really, really low. For example, Paul Harrell did a video not too terribly long back on the M17, the new service pistol that our country's military, that the U.S. military has adopted. And in that video that he did on that particular service pistol, or the civilian version of the service pistol at least, not that I think there's any great difference, but he mentioned that at least his version, and I think this is case of the military version as well, that it came with night sights that are self-illuminating basically. And he pointed out that with those night sights, even with the environment relatively dark, as long as he could basically make out the outline of the target, he could get sufficiently accurate shots with it. Having enough light to use your sights usually isn't overly difficult, especially if whatever you're using for sights are self-illuminating. So in the case of a handgun, tritium night sights that glow always, that's the nice thing about tritium. There are some other glow-in-the-dark kinds of sights that are out there that use basically a phosphorus paint. They don't always, they don't stay on throughout the entire night, so you'll hit them with a bit of light and they'll glow for a little while, but it's not indefinite. Eventually it'll fade out during the night. The nice thing about tritium is that it lasts through the entire night. In fact, tritium will last several years. But sights that are like that are self-illuminating in some way, don't require a whole lot of ambient light or light in general in order to be able to put rounds in the part of the target that you need to put rounds. Stating that as generally as I can. It is not overly difficult to get effective rounds on target so long as the sighting system that you have is self-illuminating and you have at least a little bit of light in the environment to use. And frankly, most of the time that's what I use, and that's why there's no light on this specific gun. When I use this gun, this is not my only bedside defense gun. This is the one that I use when I'm out and about because this fits in my suitcase a whole lot better than my other guns do. But when I'm out and about, I'm usually in hotel rooms, and in hotel rooms it's pretty easy to come by relatively decent ambient light sources. Leave the light on in the bathroom. Turn on the TV, turn on the light that's over the little stove in the kitchenette, etc., etc. There's lots of ways to get night lights. There's lots of ways to get a decent amount of ambient light that is at least enough to get sufficiently accurate shots on target, we'll say. That's one level of lighting, and for basic being able to hit the target where you need to hit the target, that's all that you need. But unfortunately, in some environments, you have to deal with the fact that there could be friendlies among the foes, and that's where the second level of lighting comes in. The first level of lighting is basically just being able to get effective shots on target. And that level of lighting is usually very low, especially if the sighting system you have is self-illuminating. On this gun I have a red dot sight. The red dot, of course, is its own illumination source. The red dot is a point of illumination there, and so it illuminates itself. I don't need a whole lot of ambient light in order to make use of that. So provided you have a self-illuminating sighting system, ambient light that is necessary to get shots on target, accurate shots on target, really isn't very high. But like I said, in the secondary level of consideration is situations where you might have friends and foes mixed together. For example, if you're not like me, when I travel, I travel alone, and anyone who would be breaking into my hotel room is not going to be a friend. Okay, if they've gotten to the point where they're actually breaking into the room, they're not a friend. I can be very, very, very confident of that. But there are other people with different living situations. So, for example, say you're not traveling and you're not alone. Let's say you have a family, and let's say maybe you have teenagers. That's a scary thought in and of itself. And let's say, you consider the possibilities of things that teenagers do. Teenagers are in that state of life where they can be a bit on the rebellious side, and some of them very much so are, and they'll wind up making some really dumb decisions. And that might include, say, sneaking out late at night and then trying to sneak back in, and that's wrong. But shooting them in the back as they're fumbling through the window is probably an overreaction. So while it doesn't take a lot of light in order to get accurate rounds on target, it does take more light in order to positively identify a target. That is this a burglar, or is this my teenage son who is out drinking with his friends? That kind of level of light is higher. And anytime you're talking about that level of light or more, it is usually very, very, very beneficial, if not even outright necessary, to put some kind of a flashlight directly on the gun. Like I said, in my particular situation, for how this particular gun gets used, it gets used in hotel rooms where I have access generally to some kind of ambient light, and I don't really need to make a whole lot of, it's just not the situation. I don't really need to make careful distinctions about my targets. If anyone comes into my hotel room, they're not a friend. I travel alone. There's no friendlies coming in at my hotel room late at night. That's not the way that works. So it's not a concern for me, but like I said, if you have a different living situation, or just a different situation in general, that can be a very different thing. You very well may need to identify between friend and foe. And having a greater source of illumination and something that you can actually point in a particular direction to get light, extra light where you need it, can be very helpful. Is this a burglar, or is this my teenage son who made a really, really, really stupid decision? Okay. Being able to make that kind of distinction is important. Now, I think that people overplay that to a certain extent, and in some ways, correctly, in some ways, not. There actually have been cases where parents have accidentally shot their kids because they snuck out of the house and they snuck back in, and their parents thought that they were burglars. Things like that do actually happen. And so in that sense, it's not overplayed at all. That is a real world scenario. That actually, that is a thing. But it is overplayed in the sense that they make it sound like the light is the determining factor in that scenario. And it's certainly very, very, very helpful. And because of that, if you have that living situation where you might need, where you're using that particular gun, you might need to distinguish between friend and foe, that yes, you should have a light on the gun. But I think the importance of the light gets overplayed because you do have other means of determining friend from foe, like simply talking to the person. If the person is not actually threatening you and you live in an environment such that you have the potential for friends and foes mixed together, and more often friends than foes, then simply verbally interacting with the person can usually prevent lots of those mishaps right there. You catch someone backing in through the living room window, and you can just simply say, "Halt, who goes there?" while holding the gun in the low ready. And if they answer, "It's me, Billy, your son," yeah, probably not a good idea to shoot them. Okay. The idea of something between observing a potential problem and shooting said potential problem is something that seems to elude some people. That you do have other options. Some people say, well, just making sure that your observation is correct is what you really need, so get a light on the gun. And I'm not saying a light is a bad thing, but there are other options between observation and shooting. Okay. If you are in a situation where you're dealing with someone who may be a threat or not, and as long as they're not an imminent threat, they're not coming after you, there's nothing that's particularly wrong with verbally interacting with them and challenging them. Who are you? Why are you here? Halt, who goes there? There is a reason why in the military, and I grew up in a military household, but there's a reason why in the military you are told to challenge everyone who comes, who approaches your post, one of your general orders. And that is because the military wants to make sure that their assets are secure, but they also understand that shooting anything that seems like a potential problem is not a good idea either. Something between observation and shooting. Okay. And does a light help with that and giving you a better identification of the target? Yes, it does. It's not a bad thing to have. Certainly not. And eventually down the road, I plan on actually getting a light. One of the Olight models. I think it'll be probably one of the Valkyrie USB ones that you can, basically plug into your laptop and charge it up that way. I plan on getting, and I want one of those ones in particular because they're quick detach and you can put them on lots of different kinds of guns. And I have lots of different kinds of guns and different scenarios under which I use them, so that appeals to me. So I do actually plan on getting that eventually. I just don't feel it's particularly necessary for this gun in this kind of an environment. It's not a bad thing to have. I'm not dissing the idea of having a light. I'm dissing why people say that it is absolutely necessary. In most situations, you do have the option of doing something that's between observing a potential problem and shooting a potential problem. Okay. Like I said, verbally interacting with the target, as long as it's not acting against you, is a perfectly valid and very reasonable thing to do. Now, if this person that you observe coming into your living room, you can't quite make out exactly who it is, and they charge you, well, if they're someone you know or not, if they charge you, they're a threat. Okay, even if it is your drunk uncle, and he decided that he doesn't like you right then and there, he's a threat to you, even if you know him. Identifying the target isn't going to help you in that situation all that much. Okay, so yes, there is something to having aimable light that is better than you're going to get with some kind of ambient light or night light or oven hood light or something like that. There is definitely something to that, but I also think that people overplay it a little bit. All right, and then the third level of lighting that you could have is the really uber super tactical kind of lighting where you blind your opponent. And there's a term that all the cool kids use that I'm trying to remember right. That's what it is, the photonic barrier effect. That a lot of the tactical guys like to talk about. I have a really super bright light on my gun so that I can employ a photonic barrier if need be. And all that it is just tactical, a way of saying, I have a light that is so bright that they're not going to be able to see much else. The idea is that if you shine a bright light in someone's face, they're not going to really be able to see anything but that bright light and certainly nothing behind it. which is true. I mean, we've all kind of observed that to one extent or another, especially if you drive at all. You drive down the highway at night and someone has their high beams on. As they come around the corner, you're not going to see much else except for the high beams. That's what the so-called photonic barrier is all about. And there is a certain amount of truth to it. If you shine enough light at someone, they're going to lose their situational awareness to a great degree. They're not going to be able to see what's going on around them very well, and that can indeed give you a very real tactical advantage. But is that really pertinent to your particular situation? It may or may not be. Okay, again, if you're willing to employ it and do something that is between observing the problem and shooting the potential problem, then yes, it can be a very useful thing. You shine a super bright light in someone's face and you ask them, who are you and what are you doing here, etc., etc. You have something between observation and shooting that goes along with that use of that photonic barrier, then yes, it can be employed to great effect. But if the idea is simply, I want to have a really bright light to shine in someone's eyes while I'm shooting them, well, you could have done that in a low light scenario too. It's not overly necessary. And this is another thing where I have to remind people out there that everyone who recommends products is usually doing so for one of three reasons. Either the product really does work and they want to share that with you and share the joy of how much better this product makes your life. That's one possibility. Two is they bought the product and it doesn't work all that well, but they're trying to justify their purchase. Or three, they're the ones selling the product. Okay, only one of those three reasons is actually a very good reason. And when it comes to lights in particular, my experience is more so that it's either people are trying to justify their purchase, or maybe, just maybe, they're trying to sell it. I'm not saying that having a light on the gun is a bad thing at all, but I'm just saying that it's not a do-all in and of itself. It can be very useful to have such a bright light that the person that you're confronting cannot effectively see you or anything behind the light. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and that is truly a tactical advantage. But your responsibilities as a gun owner and a home defender don't end there. And the idea that you need a light to identify targets, well, it certainly helps, but it's not absolutely necessary. Like I said, verbally challenging the person that you're interacting with, saying, who are you? And if they respond with, I'm Nancy, your wife, unless your wife is not named Nancy, then that's a major problem. But if they respond and say, hey, I'm so-and-so that you know, well, then you don't really need the light to identify them. I think it's oversold. It's not a bad product per se, but also I challenge just how necessary it is. The first level of lighting, enough lighting to actually identify, to get accurate shots on target. That level of lighting, yes, you need that, and that's going to vary depending on what kind of a sighting system you have. If you have a self-illuminating sighting system, that level of ambient light can be very, very, very low. But if you need, but the other levels of lighting are not necessarily bad to have. It's just, do you really, really, really need them? And the answer is usually no. Good to have, yes. Absolutely necessary, especially if you're willing to actually interact with the potential threat, as long as they're not, charging you. And if they are charging you, take care of what business you need to take care of. But as long as you're willing to do something between observing the potential problem and shooting the potential problem, how necessary those other levels of lights are can become a little bit more debatable. It's not a bad thing, and like I said, I do plan on putting a light on this gun that will also fit on many of my other guns. But compared to the other pieces of kits, I don't consider it as essential. Now, what I will consider, at least not as essential to be attached to the gun, if you can get enough light to, get accurate shots on target using, an oven hood light, or using a night light, or a TV that's on, or the bathroom light, or whatever, then fine, go for it. As long as you feel that those sources of light are suitably bright and suitably reliable, you don't live in an area that has a lot of brownouts or blackouts, etc., then go for it. Something that you absolutely cannot do without, though, is some kind of a sighting system. And there are lots of different kinds of sighting systems that are out there. The two main competitors for home situations, home defense situations, are open sights. That's what the black things on the back and the front are. Those are open sights. The front one has a little post, and then in the rear there's a little peep that you look through. Those are the open sights, and then in between that I have a red dot. Those are the two main kinds of sighting systems that people will use on a home defense gun, and that is because they are the kinds of sighting systems that are generally the easiest to use in that kind of a situation. There are low power variable optics, there are high power variable optics, there are prism sights, there are the, what are they called? It's usually Trijicon that makes them, at least the really good ones. ACOGs, there we go. Kind of a form of a prism sight, but a really uber duper super cool one. So ACOGs, more general prism sights, low power variable optics, high power variable optics, all those kinds of things are great, fine, and wonderful, but they're usually not necessarily going to be your best option in home defense, and that's just because one of the main reasons is that in a home defense scenario you're usually not shooting past 50 yards. If you have a home in which you're going to legitimately have a shot that is greater than 50 yards, I would like to come over just to hang out, because obviously that's a pretty big home. Just saying. 50-yard hallway. That's doing pretty good. You just don't really need magnification in those situations. It's just not that big of a thing. And then also dealing with, raising the gun up and having to deal with that kind of that fish lens kind of thing going on, where it kind of bubbles out on you, can be a little bit distracting, especially for low-skill people. Now, with enough training, you can make a low-power variable optic work for you very well, or a prism sight work very well for you. But I'm saying for average, typical, normal people, something that is not distracting, that's very easy to use, is going to be your best bet. And that is usually going to be either the open sights, and a lot of times the gun will come with the open sights, or a red dot. And the main advantages and disadvantages of them are as follows. Open sights are great in that they don't have any electronics to break on them, so they pretty much always work. They're usually very rugged, they're very durable, they're just there, and they just work. Hold zero very well, very little issues. Attach them, get it sighted in, and you're pretty much good to go. The disadvantages of them, though, is that you need a fairly high level of light for them to work. So if you're going to rely on your open sights, you pretty much need to get a flashlight on your gun. Okay, because open sights do not work in the dark, generally speaking. There are a few guns out there that are of this kind of form factor that are bigger profile guns that have had self-illuminated open sights, but that is very rare. Very, very, very rare. For example, the IWI X95 Tavor in 9mm, it would be a PC3, a pistol caliber gun with a third point of contact. It does come with open sights that does include a little tritium dot in the front sight post. So if you're holding the gun normally and you're basically by force of habit are putting your eye right behind the peep in the back, you're going to look forward and you're going to see that tritium dot, and you're going to have a self-illuminating sight system. But that is very rare. In fact, of the guns that I've actually been able to handle in my lifetime, that is the only gun that I know of that actually had any kind of provision for night sights that was of this kind of a form factor. It's the only one I've ever known that's like that. All of the other ones that have open sights, they are not night sights. They are not self-illuminating at all. So they don't work in the dark. Basically means you really need a flashlight on the gun. And The second part that is bad about open sights is that there are technically 4 things that you need to align when using them. So using them is actually kind of complicated. That is, you need to align both the front and the rear sight, and that can take some time. You need to align it with the target, of course, and then your eye usually has to be in a fairly specific spot right behind them in order to get effective shots. Everything has to be aligned. There's a particular place where your eye needs to be, or is a particular spot where the rear sight needs to be, where the front sight needs to be, and of course everything needs to be lined up with your target. So there's 4 things that you're having to worry about. In contrast to that, you have the red dot sighting system. The red dot sighting system has a couple of disadvantages. One is that it is an electronic device, and like any electronic devices, it can fail, sometimes without warning. So there's that. So you lose a little bit of reliability in terms of just whether or not it will function. And then on top of that, you have the issue of possibly losing zero. Not all red dots are created the same, and especially depending on the environment you're using them and how hard you are on them, red dots are more prone to losing zero than the open sights are. That being said, modern red dots have come a very long way, such that for a relatively low cost you can actually get sights that have a very long lifetime, and both in battery life and just general working. And they're also much more rugged than they used to be, and therefore hold zero much better than they used to. But still, compared to open sights, which are, little things that you screw and then you leave them and that's all there is to it, red dot sights are technically less reliable and still technically more prone to losing zero. Not nearly as much as it used to be, but technically in comparison, that is an issue. The advantages of red dots, though, even though you do lose some reliability and you do potentially lose some accuracy, at least depending on models and whatnot, what you gain is simplicity of use. Instead of having to align 4 things, with red dots, you basically only have to align 2. The target and the red dot. Put the red dot in the center of the target and pull trigger. That's pretty much all you have to do. Now, before with the open sights, I mentioned 4 things that you have to have aligned. You have to have the targets, you have to have the front sight, the rear sight, and your eye in a particular place to use. The nice thing about red dots, though, is I don't have to have my eye in a particular place. I can hold it over here, I can hold it over here, I can hold it up here, I can hold it down here. I can have it just about anywhere, as long as it's basically behind the optic, and as long as I can see the red dot, even if it's not in the center of my field of view, it will be close enough that within home defense distances, within 50 yards and less, and like I said, if you have a house that is more than 50 yards, I really just want to see it. In terms of having a single shot through your house that could be that long, I just want to see. Be curious to me, because that's 150 feet. That is a really long hallway, just saying. Within those distances, your eye placement really doesn't matter that much. Another advantage that you have with red dots, in addition to only having 2 things to line up, and because of that it is much easier to get on target, much faster, much less of a mental headache, much easier to do under stress. In addition to that, another thing that you have with red dots that you can take advantage of is infinite eye relief. With optics, not necessarily open sights, but with magnifying optics, there's usually a particular place where you need to be behind the optic. Some will have an eye relief of, say, 1.5 inches. You get 1.5 inches behind the optic, and that's where your eye needs to be in order to see through it correctly. Red dots aren't like that. They have an infinite eye relief, and basically I can take this thing and I can mount it as forward as I want to, or as far back as I want to, and it will function exactly the same. The reason why I have it so far forward is, well, this is the furthest point on the gun that is still attached to the main receiver, rather than the handguard. I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's a little seam there. I'm not putting it on the handguard because that can wobble just a little bit, so it's still on the receiver. And the reason why it's so far forward is so that I can keep the gun up and still see what's going on the left, and also still see what's going on the right, and of course see my primary target area as well. You put all that together, and you have great situational awareness. The way that you usually have to run a long gun is basically run it low wherever you go, and then find your target, raise, shoot, lower to look around, raise. And that's the way you're supposed to do it, and there's lots of good practical applications of that. One of the best ones is that if you're always lowering your gun, you're not pointing a gun at someone that you don't need to, potentially. And if you're in environments where there are friendlies and foes around, not pointing guns at people that you don't need to is really a good idea. And that's the way that you should do it. But if we're talking about low-skill people, and we're talking about how people behave when they're panicked and anxious and their life is on the line, sometimes those things don't really kick in. It usually takes a decent amount of training to build the discipline to lower the weapon again. The nice thing about a red dot that's forward mounted is even if I make the mistake of accidentally keeping the gun up, at least I won't be losing situational awareness. I'll be able to see what's on the left, I'll be able to see what's in the right, I'll be able to see through the optic just fine without any fisheye lens or anything like that going on. Great situational awareness. Okay. So those are the two competing options, are open sights and red dot, and you can see my solution. I run both. Some red dots will sit low enough that you can actually use it with the open sights. You'll be able to see the open sights through the red dot, and you get the best of both worlds that way. This one technically sits just a little bit high, so I can't see the open sights through it. But the reason why I have the open sights still, even though I can't see it through the red dot, is that if the red dot ever goes out on me, I look through the sight, oh, it's not on, battery's dead. And if I don't happen to have a spare battery with me, which I do always carry in my suitcase, but if I don't happen to have a spare battery, I can just unscrew the red dot, and I do have a little wrench with me. I can just unscrew the red dot, run open sights, and I'll still have some kind of a sighting system that'll work. So my solution is do both, but I primarily rely on the red dot. And people talk about having flip up open sights as their backups, and the reality is that in every self-defense situation that I've seen, I have never seen backup sights be deployed. I've just never seen it. I mean, you can go to John Korea's site where she records tons of these things that have been documented on film of some form or another, on video, and never once has someone's primary optic failed them such that they had to run backup sights. Never has happened that I'm aware of. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a terrible idea, and if you want to do it, go for it. But usually these things are at a point right now where the biggest issue is the battery happens to die, and so you replace the battery. And the odds that the battery is going to happen to go bad on that exact one time is fairly low, as long as you perform regular maintenance on your red dot. And that is basically as simple as, periodically checking it to making sure that it works, and replace the battery once a year. Seriously, that's all that you need to do with it to keep it running. And there are different activation modes that they have in different styles and all that, and you can look into that yourself. But red dots are very reliable these days. And like I said, as long as you replace the battery once a year and you check on it periodically to make sure it's still doing what it's supposed to do, it's going to be just fine. It really is. And like I said, I cannot think of a single real-world scenario where someone's backup sights, their little flip-up backup sights, actually wound up being the determinative factor that won the day. I cannot think of a single instance. If you guys can, and you can actually provide documentation for it, this is the video of this is where this happened, not someone arguing for it online, or even a firearms instructor, as much as respect as I do have for them, arguing that you should do this, an actual real-world situation where this happened, in the benefit of the defender. That's what I want to see. Is there a video of this happening? Is there a documented police report of this happening? So on and so forth. I have never seen that to date. And because of that, I'm not a big fan of the backup pop-up sites. But having the open sights on the gun, even if you can't use them with the red dot, is still a good idea, because if the red dot should happen to fail for some reason, say you happen to forget your spare battery, or you drop the gun on something that was especially hard and you mangled the optic somehow. Well, if it mangled the optic, it probably mangled a few other things too. But just saying hypothetically, if it happened to ruin the optic and not anything else, well then you could just take off the optic and run the open sights. But those are the main options that get used, and they're the main options that I recommend. If you do open sights, remember they don't work in the dark. You need some kind of a light. If you run a red dot, you do lose a little bit of reliability, but you gain speed because you don't have to align up as much. It's just the red dot and the target. Like I said, not even your eye has to be in exactly the right place. You gain speed, you gain simplicity. It's self-illuminating, so you can use it in much lower lighting levels. You don't necessarily have to have a light on the side of the gun. It's not a bad idea still, but you don't necessarily have to have one on the side of the gun. And like I said, these things are very durable these days. This one is a Hollow Sun, and this is the one that I put on this gun last year, and I actually still haven't changed the battery on it. I probably actually should do that because it is about a year old now. But it's still just running just fine and no issues whatsoever. And I use this gun basically every single weekday. I don't usually use it on the weekends because on the weekends I'm usually home. Sometimes I wind up being home during the week as well. It just kind of depends on the work schedule and whatnot. But I usually use this gun when I'm out and about, which is pretty often. And I'll often turn up the brightness setting on the optic and all that kind of thing when I'm in my hotel room, and it does just fine. It's great. No issues to complain about there. And then, last but not least, my last recommendation, Sling. For a home defense gun, I don't think that a sling is absolutely necessary, just like I don't think that having a light attached to the gun is absolutely necessary, as long as you can get ambient light that's bright enough to get effective hits on targets, provided that you're operating in an environment where you don't have friends mixed with foes. So, yes, I don't think you need to have a light attached to the gun in all situations. I would also say the same thing about slings. You don't have to have them attached to the gun in all situations, but they are still a really handy thing. And the nice thing about them is that they basically are, for a long gun, what a holster is for your handgun. That it gives you a way to maintain control of the gun and still have your hands free. So if I take this thing and put it on like I normally would, I can throw this thing over to the side. I have my hands free. I can do whatever I need to do. So let's say if it was a really bad day and I actually did have to shoot someone, which I hope never ever happens, and hopefully you all are of the same opinion. You don't ever want to be in that situation. You'll do what you need to do to defend yourself and your loved ones, but it's not something that you look forward to, at least if you have a modicum of brains and sense and empathy at all. You're not going to want to be in a position to hurt someone. But if you're forced into that situation, you may very well wind up with a bleeding person in front of you. And the moral thing to do, and I'm speaking now as a Reformed Christian, the moral thing to do is to try to preserve life as long as it doesn't put the situationally innocent at an undue risk. We do believe in preserving life, but biblically speaking, we also recognize the difference between someone who is situationally guilty and situationally innocent. And we're not going to allow the situationally innocent to be put at undue risk. But as long as that isn't the issue, we do try to preserve life, which means that if this person is no longer a threat, they're unconscious or whatever, trying to render aid to them does become an issue. Also, you're going to want to call the police or whoever to let them at least know where to pick up the body, but also to let people know what's going on and get the right people over there to take care of the situation. And you need your hands for that. If you're dealing with a family situation, you live with your wife and kids and all those kinds of things. You might have your kids, the burglar woke everybody up, including you. You had to shoot them, and now you've got your kids running around and your wife, maybe in hysterics because now there's this bleeding guy on her living room floor. That's not exactly a pleasant thing to wake up to, and for kids, that's going to be fairly traumatic. So having your hands free to deal with them it's a real world issue that you have to be able to deal with. So like I said, slings are for long guns what holsters are to handguns. It allows you to maintain positive control of the weapon while still having the availability of using your hands. And the very practical reason why I have one on mine is not because I think it's overly important. I mean, in the sense that, I'm in a hotel room. If something bad happens and I need to make a call to the police, once I've secured the body, as it were, if the fellow is dead, there's not a whole lot you can do for him. If he is not dead, but you can render aid, you can usually stash the gun far enough behind you that it's still not going to be easily accessible to him while you try to render aid. It's not a huge thing, but there is the very real fact that I do walk around the hotel room, and I don't like to be more than 3 paces away from my gun when I do that. So if I just sling it over my shoulder like this, I can carry it around and still do whatever I need to do with my hands, and always have the gun right there with me. It allows me to practically take the gun into whatever part of the hotel room, or if I'm home, into whatever part of the apartment that I need to. It's a practical way to carry it around and still have the use of my hands. Like I said, it is for long guns what holsters are to handguns. It allows you to carry this thing while still, basically going about your normal everyday routine. Now, this Sling in the Sling setup is obviously not the most comfortable in the world, but it works for around the apartment and those kinds of things. If I was to take it hiking, I would not be slinging it like this because this isn't super comfortable, but it works for its intended purpose. And that's the biggest thing, is making sure that it works for your intended purpose. If you have a gun that you want to use, as your hunting gun or your out and about gun, getting a different sling system that's maybe a little bit wider, a bit comfier, fits around the body a little bit differently, it's worth looking into. But if it's strictly home defense, you don't need anything very fancy. And this is literally basically a spare part that came with one of my guns one time. It wasn't anything special. It was one of the little bonus things that the company threw in. Look, we're helping you. It's not all that great and all that useful, but it's useful enough to free up my hands while I'm working around the hotel room, so it does the intended job. That's all that I really need. Now, as to other things that people attach to their guns, ultimately you're going to have to make the decision on what you want to attach or not. But in my opinion, for most of what I've seen, they don't really help with the defensive role that much. For example, and I've seen this, and in certain applications it makes sense. Home defense it doesn't, but I've seen people actually put bipods on their PC3's, on their pistol caliber guns with the third point of contact. Okay, in a home defense situation, there is no particularly good reason to have a bipod on your pistol caliber gun. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, you're not going to, sweat up a little fortress in the bedroom, put your little gun out there with the bipod on it, and just kind of do the turret thing. That's not usually what goes on. Now, this person that I saw did it was not using it for that reason, was not using the gun as a self-defense gun. He had other guns for that. What he was doing was basically taking it to the range and seeing how far he could push a pistol caliber gun, seeing what kind of range he could get out of it, and having a bipod on it in that application makes sense. Home defense, not so much. Okay, so bipods for home defense, not a great idea. Another thing that people will say is lasers. And lasers, it's a self-illuminating sighting system, so that part of it is good, but I've never seen them be overly useful. And again, going to real-world scenarios, I'm not aware of any real-world scenario in which someone having a laser on their gun, either a PC3 pistol caliber gun with a third point of contact like this, or even on handgun, where the laser actually made any meaningful difference. Just in the real-world scenario, people are usually way too fumbly, fidgety, etc., to actually get the laser where it needs to be, and a lot of times the lasers aren't nearly as bright as people think they are. And then, of course, the batteries on lasers will eventually go bad, and depending on how much, finger time you put on that laser, you can wear out the battery pretty quickly, and it becomes practically useless. I've just never seen it, for one, ever actually successfully used. And two, I've never actually seen it be practical under real-world conditions. If you use it under, daylight conditions, the laser usually gets washed out. And even in normal lighting conditions for in-home in a room, sometimes it gets washed out pretty easily too. And if the person that you're dealing with, the assailant that you're dealing with, is wearing dark clothing, sometimes the laser will wash out on that as well. And then, like I said, there's battery life issues and all kinds of other things that go on. It's just usually not all that particularly helpful. There might be a few cases here and there in which it's helpful, especially if you can't get a decent sighting system on the gun itself. Laser might be your only way to get it to have a sighting system. But in that scenario, I would suggest that maybe you need a different gun that actually has some kind of proper sights, or you can put proper sights on. Laser is at best a band-aid for another problem. And I would usually suggest that taking care of whatever the other problem is usually the better way to go. So yeah, don't do the bipod thing on a self-defense gun, a home defense gun. Lasers generally are a fix for some other kind of problem, fix the other problem. I'm trying to think of other things that people attach. I mean, there's night vision and stuff that people will attach, and that's usually fairly heavy. And for a home defense scenario, I mean, we're talking across the living room type distances here. Finding him in the dark isn't going to be that much of an issue. Like I said, if you have a light on the gun or a modicum of ambient lights, that's usually not all that hard to find the guy. So, night vision, those kinds of things, not really all that useful. In fact, the vast majority of everything that I've seen that you can attach to a gun probably shouldn't be. But the three things that I mentioned here, those are definitely worth looking into. Having some kind of a light source. It doesn't necessarily have to be attached to the gun, but you need a light source of some kind that at the very least allows you to put accurate enough shots on target. Turns out that's not very high. Paul Harrell's video on the M17 shows that it doesn't have to be very high if you have a self-illuminating lighting system, but at least that level. And it's a really good idea. I wouldn't say it's absolutely essential, but it's a really good idea to think about getting enough light to positively identify targets, especially if you're in an environment where you can have both friends and foes together, and especially if you have more friends around than foes. If you're living with your family, they're more likely than not than the people that you're going to encounter in your home late at night. Little Susie had to get up to use the bathroom. That might be somewhat annoying, but probably not worth shooting little Susie over. Hopefully we can agree. Okay. Also, having enough lighting to possibly effectively blind your opponent might not be a bad thing either. I think it can get a little bit oversold, and there's the whole tactical thing of the photonic barrier and whatnot. It's probably oversold, but at the same time, there is a true tactical advantage there. If I can see you and you cannot at least effectively see me, that does give me an advantage. That is a real thing. How necessary that is, I think, is debatable, but it is an advantage. That much I don't think is debatable. And then after having some kind of a light source, whether ambient light of a sufficient level or a light on the gun, you need a sighting system that can make use of that light. The two most common sighting systems that are going to be out there, which I happen to use both of, are open sights, which are usually very rugged, reliable, always going to be there. They typically hold zero very well. They can be a little bit complicated to use because you technically have to line up four things: the target, front sight, rear sight, and your eye has to usually be in a fairly particular place. So it is somewhat complicated to use, a little bit slower to use, and a big disadvantage of them is they do not work very well in low light scenarios. The other major sighting system that is out there that works well in defensive situations, magnified optics of one kind or another usually don't do so great, especially at close distances, and you get the fisheye effect and all those kinds of things. They can be used with training very well, actually, but for low skill people who are new to firearms and whatnot, they usually don't wind up being a great idea. But the category of optic that can be good if you're not going to go for optics for open sights is the red dot sight. It is illuminated, so it works in the low light scenarios very well. It's not typically as rugged and reliable, doesn't hold zero necessarily as well as open sights do, but they've come a long way, and for most people, under the vast majority of circumstances, they're going to be much more than adequate. Like I said, a lot of them have a battery life of a year or more, some of them 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, which is ridiculous, but a lot of them have very long battery life right now, and that's pretty much the only reason why people who are running red dots encounter any problems is because they forgot to change their batteries regularly. That's basically the only thing that you have to do with them. Change the battery once a year and you'll be fine. And the advantage of them is they're, in addition to being self-illuminated, they're very easy to use. All you have to do is put the red dot in the center of whatever you want to hit, and that's all the alignment that you really have to worry about. Your eye behind it really doesn't have to be in a super specific place. It's got a very forgiving eye box, and you can also, because it has infinite eye relief, you can put it wherever on the top of the gun you want to. You can have it all the way forward, you can have it all the way back, whatever suits your needs. I like it a little bit more forward, just so that I have greater situational awareness on each side. But you can really tailor it to pretty much whatever you want on that one. So have some kind of a lighting source, have something to make use of that light, either open sights or red dot being the main two. Optics that include magnification can be used, but usually not as easily, especially for low-skill people. It can be done, but it usually takes a little bit more training. And then last but certainly not least, get a sling. Like I said, it's basically, to a long gun, what a holster is for your handgun. Okay, it gives you a way to have the gun on you, but have your hands free. Lots of scenarios where you might need that. Very useful thing. All right, thank you very much for your time and attention and listening to the explanation for all these things. I hope you guys have a good one out there. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. And for those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to understand the true Christ of history. Amen.